Marijuana prohibition is used to regulate black and brown bodies in the status quo. They condemn people to material conditions created by the prison industrial complexes, ACLU, and 13. Black people were 3.7 times white people arrested for marijuana possession, and white people despite agreeable usage of marijuana arrested for illegal. All drug-related arrests war on marijuana has disproportionately reward people of color, state and local governments, and aggressively enforced marijuana laws selected against black people and communities and staring hundreds of thousands of people in the criminal justice system finding show pronounced racial disparities in marijuana arrests despite a majority of Americans now support marijuana legalization. States enforcing marijuana possession laws aggressive, but policing marijuana is common to consuming, costly, racially biased, and doesn't work. These arrests have a significant detrimental impact on people's lives as well as the communities in which they live. When people are arrested for possessing the tiny amount of marijuana, they can be disqualified from housing or student financial aid, lose their finding more difficult to obtain employment, lose custody of their children, or be deported. The organization also urges lawmakers and law enforcement to reform policing practices, including ending racial profiling as well as unconstitutional stop and fruit searches, and the prison industrial complex is a tool of neoliberal control that sustains anti-blackness to drive for racial hierarchies and structural ability that allows for oppressive institutionalized forms of racism to continue while poverty populations benefit from. This is done in 12. Socioeconomic institutions manage inherent relationships with the conflict and power in capitalist society, and how these institutions provide the structural stability for capitalist accumulation, will key feature of the neoliberal in the U.S. The rise of oppressive institutionalized racism in the form of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration reestablished racial order in the neoliberal. African Americans were the leading answer to the class struggle and long-standing racial division within the general segregation. Incarceration is going to strengthen this new racial division and new class lines between poor whites and elites in the neoliberal. Mass incarceration is linked with the rise of racial segregation to manage the social and economic inequities of African Americans and migrated to large industrial cities, started working in organized industries in response. Capital closed was urban factories. This capital strike characterized neoliberal and led to the dissemination of main sectors, mass incarceration, and the neoliberal SSA keeps unemployed and marginally attacks African Americans under control. Mass incarceration is more complex, whereby populations that do not fit the labor force are effectively managed. Mass incarceration serves to replace the welfare state and the management of economic stability. This is the poor with no way to survive. Such a situation can be disruptive to capital accumulation, and mass incarceration serves to manage it. Mass incarceration is taken up this argument function by first separating and then locking up. Mass incarceration serves to create a new scripted category to manage the population by magnifying the third of mass incarceration helps legitimate the defensive properties and the responsibilities of the state. Incarceration used to disrupt the working class movement. Neoliberalism involves crushing activism on many fronts. African American, militant class, conscious, radical segments of working class, especially revolutionary black workers. The Black Panther Party was part of the process of defeating the working class movement. Analyzing mass incarceration helps illuminate the dynamics of mass incarceration in capitalist society. Understanding how prison system functions is an imperative task. And the prison system has reproduced a white supremacist state only by criticizing the construction of the British regime can we break it down, taking steps towards abolition. The process of invisible violence inherent in the prison industrial complex is rooted in the racialized humanizing framework. The proximate cause of genocidal violence, check your views on forward. Violence also takes the form of class, racial self-destruction, central approach to the blurring categories to see two more time peace on violence, our attention, pathology, the class, racial gender inequalities, and violence continue. No, class of multitude, small words, individual genocides, connected to normal social spaces, violence continue refers to the ease in which humans are capable of reducing socially vulnerable, external non-person, and assuming license for slides, and misrecognizing proper genocidal practices in daily normative behavior, peace on such as the criminal industrial complex constitute invincible genocide, normative everyday forms of violence hidden in the normal social practices. Post-industrial prison industrial complex has the Republican consensus on the new mobilization, the fear of the mob, the records of black men is essential. We recognize the acts of violence. The violence can continually include all expressions of radical social exclusion, dehumanization, depersonalization, reification, which normalizes atrocity, behavior, and violence towards others. Everyday violence encompasses the implicit legitimate and returns forms of violence inherent in particular social, economic, and political formations. We're bringing the discourse on genocide, everyday normative experience, what makes mass violence genocide possible, priming, push social consensus toward evaluating certain forms of human life, and the examination of the prison industrial complex is challenging the historical underpinnings of what is allowed to grow, advocating for institutional reforms in the name of justice, upholds the ideals of revolutionary actors by targeting normative practices of racism. Be care, no sense. Rooted in deep historical patterns and more effective the prison industrial complex reduces and reproduces many of our nation's most egregious narratives and practices regarding racial discrimination. People of color are more likely to be in prison than white defendants who commit the same crime. While African Americans constitute 13% of the nation's population, they can also almost half of those in prison for non-violent offenses. The disparity disorder of the prison industrial complex functions as the machine of racial injustice interlocking to oppression in America. Since the process was also skewed by racial factors, example, the disparate standards for cracking cocaine, the very mechanics of justice, from active political representation to sentencing guidelines for towards systematic race-based discrimination. Prison industrial complex also reproduces racism once people have entered its walls. 75% of the people the U.S. government attempts to execute are black or Latino. Sentencing patterns make a bold statement about whose lives are valuable. Thus, Hope and I advocate for a discussion of marijuana legalization that centers on black, brown, and red bodies. Discussions are critical for only we struggle in the hard place. We don't understand radical transformation. Our app is needed to disrupt the colorblind policy that exists around us. Many people are arrested, convicted, and prosecuted, leaving them condemned to the prison system without accounting for the status quo legal regime. All sovereignty will miss the point. More bottom men, 14. The burden of responsibility is yours to allow you taking advantage of political economic opportunities, disability, racial indifference. The prison industrial complex is just not one of the private prisons. The prison industrial complex is fighting the drug laws. But best make our traditional hallmark of young aggressive mindset leads to sensitivity about a great many issues for young people today. Sweat, shop labor, the food one eats, various connections to the treatment of animals, the degradation of the environment, and urbanization of environments. The question because of hard white privilege. There are more people in prison and jail stations for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all racial communities for racially defined drug war, substance exclusively communities of color. Despite drugs have shown people of color no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Our nation's prisons are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. 80 to 90% of all drug offenders in the prison have been African American. Folks of color are caught with a small amount of marijuana, arrested in the jail, entitled with a criminal record that will follow the rest of their lives. We're talking about a racist system that enforces laws against black and brown people. It has been the reviewing fair to recognize basic dignity and humanity. The legalization is inevitable too, and there's a really important opportunity for us to erase in our society. That legalization needs to happen. If it happens without the kind of reflection that needs to occur for us to really understand what makes the dynamic for immersion, we missed it. There are also those who said there's no hope of any mass incarceration in America system. We were resigned to truth from the side. We've got to awaken for all some of the realities of race in America. We've got to embrace those criminal, not necessarily our liberation with them, the humanists. It has been the refusal and failure to recognize basic dignity and humanity of all people that has formed the sturdy foundation for every caste system. Bring down mass incarceration and search our power and resurrecting Jim Crow. Seems that human nature is to cling to one's advantages and privileges. Only when we decided to struggle to become like able to open up to something other than what there was. In the days of Jim Crow, the best way to deal with was to leave the South to get over the places that we thought were wrong in the development of our humanity, but the South was never really opened up to change and deal. An increasingly significant number of us decided to stay in the South and struggle to change the South. Only when we decided to stop leaving the hard place and to struggle in the hard place were we able to begin to open it up to something other than what there was. And we saw our evidence is reverse causal. We delegitimize white supremacy and other policy discussions, and we foster support for other anti-racist movements. Ostracking online and left. Critical race theory got ourselves into a trajectory systematic racism and offers got anti-racist action and discourse. We suggest that efforts begin with developing our apologetic, theoretical, and critical grounded agenda for delegitimating and dismantling racism institutional manifestation. We will begin with the criminal justice system, anti-racism, take very seriously the task of ending the war on drugs. War on drugs has been the primary mechanism through which populations of color have been made subject to state coercion, surveillance, and civil rights movement. And there are significant signs of hope for such movement against the drug war. Studies have shown that criminalization of cannabis is a crucial goal. Perpetually racially centered war on drugs. Marijuana arrests have all drug-related arrest possession accounted for 82% of the increase. African Americans represent 30% of all marijuana-related arrests. The drug war has been largely dependent on and employed around criminalized cannabis. California Proposition 19, the fair citizen got put to the general need to be explicit about why the drug war and the project of mass incarceration should be natural. Must be explicit about our resistance to such institutional practice, the manifestation of systematic racism. Anti-racism must be a part of the resistant discourse. Central position that we should operate as organic intellectuals. We share an ethical commitment and fundamental connections to the public and supports us depends on our contribution to broader society and tangible communities. Our responsibilities as public intellectuals to ask social change agents and to afford public discourse and political debate and engage social problems. First, we must take seriously the responsibility of recentering dominant discourse on issues of race and racism. Where we might wait 40 years of propaganda, we also take responsibility for failing to inject our own political perspectives into public discourse. Separation of the lived experience contribute to our own social significance. We take a tangible step toward ending mass imprisonment in the U.S. drug war by seeking high visibility outlets for our critical works. Challenging the legitimacy of visible political pundits who certainly have the opportunity to reclaim a fundamentally revised educational institution and curricula that train justice professionals. Students better understand social change. The nature of the state has become apparent. Explore more critical approaches that emphasize formal social justice goal of training legal and justice professionals. Does it make sense for us to train students to become guards and soldiers and institutions already proven to be utter and abysmal failures? The reason we rely on prisons for creating for public safety is because intellectuals we find the question about is still legitimate. We are the ones who educate future policymakers and lawyers, as well as the think tanks and the research institutes, to play very active roles in challenging colleagues and departments that continue an uncritical reification of manifestly oppressive institutional practices. We, joining these grassroots struggles in their communities as partners, we confront the resistance spectrum militant white supremacy and fascism. Further, white supremacist ideology was a debate over everything from immigration reform to domestic economic policy. We take such threats more seriously by a more active approach to violently confronting white supremacy and our communities and their legitimacy and policy debates.
Right? Yeah. Cool, you're good. So you say you advocate a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, isn't a discussion inevitable in a debate?
No. People have showed up to debates and not spoken. People have showed up to debates and not listened.
I guess I'm confused about what the affirmative is advocating, because you also read this like Austritalian Armenian evidence that you spend a lot of time on that talks about sort of your engagement with the law. You say we suggest efforts begin with developing unapologetic, theoretically and empirically grounded agendas for the delegitimation and dismantling of racism's institutional manifestation, and you begin with the criminal justice system. Is that the app?
Well, no, I think
the advocating a discussion is like kind of nebulous.
Well, I mean, if you want me to explain it, I can to you. So here's how it works. Our app says that we should have discussions of marijuana legalization, but only centered around those bodies that would have been otherwise excluded from the conversation. More Bachman is very.
So the affirmative is a question of injecting sort of what you talk about as organic intellectuals within that conversation?
That's a pretty solid conceptualization.
Cool. So when you talk about putting lived experience in public discourse, this debate would be an example of that.
A good, solid conceptualization, yeah.
Cool. Okay, great. That's helpful to know. So you also, in the piece of evidence that you read, are talking about mass incarceration as a form of racial divisiveness or division. So the intention of the affirmative is to challenge that practice of incarceration through the inclusion of organic intellectual scholarship.
Well, we think that interjecting our own critical perspectives, but also taking time to recognize that these things exist and that they are bad and make them clear to people every time we stand up in this debate community and when we go outside of the community is important and good to bring down the place that will put, or the place that they put the bodies that aren't accepted into our society.
Word. So is that what you're talking about when you talk about like small wars and invisible genocides and the Shepherd Hughes evidence?
Right, like we think we got to change the way that we think and act to change the world, right?
Yeah, of course. So then you also say in the PCARE evidence that 75% of the people who the U.S. attempts to execute are Black and Latino.
Or
is that like a total? Is that a statistic that's the total number of people on death row? Or is that
so like
no, that's not prescriptive to everybody on death row. Just more of an analogy about the ways in which the structure has placed certain bodies as valuable and not valuable.
Word. Okay. And so the affirmative challenge is sort of that gap between the way in which those bodies are deemed valuable and not valuable.
yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's
Cool.
Again, solid.
Yeah. Then I'm good. Thanks.
Correct.
No.
All right.
You good for me?
Are you doing that?
No.
No.
No. We're good.
Question.
Oh, you mind if I go to the bathroom real quick?
No, you can go.
Sure.
Okay.
I can't wait. Put that down.
I just really prefer when y'all go during the other team's prep time, but they didn't take prep, so I understand. You were asked, go. Cleo and I along. Hi. The viewers watching at home. There's pause in the action.
Yeah, for a treat.
Take a commercial break. Did you know you can be an affiliate member of CETA? And through your dues, you can support the national organizations.
It's on live
everyone
stream,
bringing.
like, ad.
I'm not sure if I'm not sure. I haven't been at my university long enough to figure out the new rules. I get confused by the other universities I work at. I'm not really sure what university I'm in. Zone. So you all got here, and Rashad is here, so this is good. He made it.
Yes, we all made it.
We had dinner last night.
It was really nice.
I was enjoying watching Rashad's,
Pew.
just like his trek across the country.
Apparently he's sick, like he was.
A lot of travel would do that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if he has food poisoning or something.
Everyone's kind of generally sick. All right, good. Thanks.
Is it just on paper?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Come over here.
Are you going over?
Do you mind if I do?
No. I was just.
Is it one off or?
You can just float straight down.
All right.
I have my spiral ready to go.
Great.
I've judged for long before.
Let's float in circles.
Everyone good?
The affirmative fails to address the organized principle of settler colonialism, discourage the disavowal of native genocide as a form of gratuitous violence being reenacted in this debate. King 13. Settlement is a gratuitously violent project that kills the native and accumulates black, also reorganized discord. The relationship that exists between signifying and certified for concepts like autonomy and indigeneity and words like clearing under conditions of settlement become shifting ground beneath our feet. The prime means of destabilizing and completely evacuate due to material and discourse muscles of settlement. At the site of clearing, settlers are able to become autonomous and indigenous at the same time. Wilson helps us think about the also discursive material violence occurs within the settler master human grammatical structure. There's this about the violence genocide and the way the settler narrates the formation of the U.S. On one level, this avowal also occurs through the settler preferred part of speech. Clearing is only spoken of as a noun. Settler master human grammatical structure. Clearing is never used as a verb. Prior to clearing's fragile emphasis is labor not across the land, but it's noun and verb as the body of the savage. Speaking of civil society's essential status to an effective genocide, this scourge of displacement represents an actual displacement as a settler master human. With structure renders clearing as a static place. Clearing a static place, void of settler violence and absence of indigenous body in relation to the land. Settlers often indigenize themselves in the abstract space. Settlers are now the group of humans that establish a righteous relationship with the land. Within the process of settlement, indigenous people become embedded and are literally buried as dead within the land. Turn. The affirmative is nothing more than a demand for more equitable distribution of resources with an attempt to perfect settler colonialism. King 13. We had agreed native sovereignty must be achieved to end native genocide. However, we had just begun to conceive and envision what native sovereignty would look like. It was loosely defined as native governance or a time when native people would be in charge. This created anxiety for black women in the room. Black people in under settler colonial states often imagine themselves facing a no-win situation in the current order or under native sovereignty. Much of our anxiety rested with this lingering notion of the nation state that hung around, and taking oneself from settler colonial genocide genocide machine requires an honest assessment of our prospective investments in and reliance on the nation state as a side of restitution in the case of blacks and organized concept for vision of native sovereignty. Black struggles for an equitable distribution of resources within or among nation states that form a part of anti-racist and diasporic struggles of black people can be critiqued and from indigenous points of view. For internalizing the colonial concept of how people relate to land, resources, and wealth, there's no indigenous framework around which the struggles are carried out. Indigenous sovereignty expect black community support of the nation negotiation process regarding land resources and reparations. We have to recognize how black become completely disempowered in this process. Black and racialized people are not provided with a viable alternative within vision of the native sovereignty as they stand. This leaves black people residing on native land in a tight conundrum. What will happen to black people on native sovereignty, particularly black prisoners? Well, in order to free the land, can't we have prisons erected? We can't have prisons erected on them, right? Abolishing and demolishing prisons have to be a part of decolonizing work. Alternative is to decolonize. Tucking in 12. An ethic of incommensurability which guides the move the unsettled innocence and stands in context to aims of reconciliation, which motivates settler moves to innocence. Reconciliation is about rescuing settler normalcy, about rescuing a settler future. Concerned with the question of what decolonization looks like, what will happen after abolition, what will be the consequences of decolonization of the settler. Incommensurability acknowledges those questions need not and perhaps cannot be answered in order for decolonization to exist as a framework. Decolonization is not accountable to settlers or settler future. Decolonization is accountable to indigenous sovereignty and futurity. The answers will not emerge from friendly understanding and indeed require dangerous understanding of the uncommonality and coalition politics that may feel very unfriendly. We will need to find our answers if we get there in an exact measure that we can discern the movements which give decolonization a historical form and context. To fully enact the ethic of incommensurability means relinquishing settler futurity, abandoning the hopes that settlers may one day be commensurable to native people, removing the asterisks, periods, commas, and apostrophe, the whereabouts, the buts, and conditional clauses that punctuate decolonization and underwrite settler innocence. Decolonization offers this perspective to human and civil rights based on approaches to justice, an unsettling one rather than a complementary one. Decolonization is not an and, it is an elsewhere. The affirmative focus on race is disavowing of the colonization of Africa and rejects black people in the permanent status of property. Our decolonial project is global and inclusive. The All Alone addresses native genocide and anti-blackness. Smith 14. Colonization, the colonialism that settled in colonialism has never happened. Native studies is often articulated as concerned being primarily with colonization and decolonization, while black studies is articulated as being primarily with race and anti-racism. Distinction itself is a product of anti-blackness. Colonization of Africa must appear so that the African appear ontologically colonized. According to Justice Daniels, since only nations can be colonized, the nations in Africa have never really existed. It is only through this disavowal of colonization that black people can ontologically be relegated to the status of property. Native people, by contrast, situated as potential citizens. They may eventually become citizens if they were renounced their relationship to their Native nation demonstrate the maturity required to become a citizen. Native people's apparent proximity to whiteness should not be understood as a pathway to freedom, but as a pathway to genocide. Settler colonialism sets the very terms of the contestation. The way we're supposed to contest settler democracy is to contest the gap between what settler democracy promises and what it performs. Contesting the racial gap of settler democracy is the most effective way of actually ensuring its universality. Settler colonialism is not merely operated by racializing Native people, positioning them as racial minorities rather than colonized nation, but also through domesticating black struggles within a framework of anti-racist rather than anti-colonial struggle. Anti-blackness is effectuated through the disappearance of colonialism in order to render blacks as an internal property of the United States. Within a domesticated anti-racist framework that cannot challenge the settler state itself. Not only are the black people rendered the property of the settler state, but black struggle itself remains its property. So they continue within the confines of the settler state. The U.S. must appear hermeneutically sealed from both internal and external threats of its legitimacy and continuing existence. Indigenous people must be made to disappear as internal threats made to exist in constant state of vanishing. In no position to unsettle the settler state. The external threat posed by the global black anti-colonial struggle is made to disappear, rendering Africa as property of the United States. Anti-blackness is not only constitutive of the settler nation of the U.S., integral to the normalizing of its continuation. The solving of the prison industrial complex will not solve the onslaught of violence that black bodies face on a continuing basis, nor does it account for the other ways that the government will find in order to subjugate black people. Okay. Also, you have not taken into account the ways in which the government can still arrest black people, put them in the prison industrial complex, small crack cocaine charges that will inevitably arrest black people for because that the government will inevitably arrest black people for because the majority of the crack cocaine users are black, and that is because the U.S. government put that stuff in the black community in the first place. Advocacy is our advocacy of spirituality is a form of resistance, which we will get to. It's a form that allows us not just. Okay, thank you. Which we will get to. It's a form of resistance that allows not just us but all people of color to engage in. It's an energy that's had honored as a way of mourning the dead. The prison industrial complex is not the highest form of violence inherent in internal island policies. What about the people that don't make it to the prison industrial complex? People are fucking dying on the streets simply because of the color of their skin. Most people are not making it to the prison industrial complex. Most people are not being arrested. Most people are not going through this are not going through the legal process of them being of social death. They're dying literally, and they're dying right in they are dying immediately in the streets of how do I phrase this? They're dying immediately, and that's because of the and that's a form of black people suffer from they suffer from a form of physical death and social death because black body is viewed as inherently bad to whiteness, which is inherent in the law, which is inherent in the policies that we see that affect black, native, and black native bodies, women, and queer bodies. Anything else you want me to read? I'll coalition between them.
I need to do this.
Okay, go ahead. You have enough time? Okay, awesome.
Joy Harjo said, "Here is a city built of passion where live many houses with never falling light in many rooms. In this place your heart will never be a murderer. Come sweet, I am a house with many rooms. There is no end. Each room is a street to the next world, and you have made a fire in every room. Come, lie with me before the flame. I will dream you a wolf and suckle your newborn. I will dream you a hawk and circle this city in your racing heart. I will dream you the wind. Taste salt air on my lips until I take you apart raw. Come here. We will make a river. Flood this city built of passion with fire, with a revolutionary fire. Ichimanidu Nidu Kawashin, Jamash Kawazian, Bashbani, Ibizian, Mijijanam Zagi, Iwaylin, Ganushishanam, Bizenda Shanam, Miwenji Nagamoyan, Nimishomis Viduka Shanam, Jabiji Tuyan, Anishanabe Ijitwawin, Nijit Big Gikendama Kaya, Nishanabe Dimatism. If y'all want sage, we can do it.
Oh, you want some sage? Can we just take a moment to?
It's barely red, so if you wanted to read that,
Actually, sage really is.
cool. We can do CX whatever y'all.
I'm good.
Okay.
All right. First question. The Tuck and Yang evidence, what was the tag there? It sounded like an alternative, but what's the alt thing?
Decolonization.
Okay. So how does that work exactly? Like, so we decolonize what and how?
Decolonize the United States.
How? Do we think differently? Do we act differently?
Well, Tucker and are kind of explicitly saying, right, that decolonization is not a metaphorical action. I would argue, and they would argue as well, that it's comprised of both like material or solidarity with material struggle, as well as sort of what I think about as the like epistemological and spiritual forms of violence that we're resisting.
So we resist spiritual and epistemological forms of violence. How?
Oh, I think the one in C is an example of that.
1AC or 1NC?
1NC.
Okay,
Is an
so
example of that kind of resistance. So,
So-
our Tiffany King evidence, Tiffany King is a woman who does work with Incite Women of Color Against Violence, specifically informing Black and Red coalitionary politics. And she did a lot of ceremony work with them. She makes the argument that that ceremony work is integral to the development of decolonial theory because of sort of that piece of evidence that we read talking about the shift that's able to happen, or that was able to happen in the ceremony that they held. Between sort of like what does it look like for us to envision Native sovereignty, and how that sort of becomes possible, I guess, within sort of the spiritual realm of decolonization and decolonization of the time.
okay, so it's like there has to be a spiritual component when decolonizing. That makes no.
I would say yes.
Okay, that's cool. Let's talk about the poem at the end. I liked it a whole lot. What was its effect in this debate space?
I mean, I can't really prescribe how it affected everybody, but I read that poem specifically because I think what Joy Harjo is speaking to is sort of the way in which like decolonization requires a certain like affective transition, or does that make sense?
So
It's
you
sort
have
of
to,
what she's talking about is like I'm a house with many rooms, right? Which is for me like a spatial relationship that becomes decolonized in the sense that like we don't think of space as something that we just inhabit as per the King evidence, but also that she's talking about I'm going to flood this place with fire, with revolutionary fire, right? So there's this like passion.
So it's like you need to be
sort of
passionate.
affective.
Okay,
Yeah.
so like what you do has to be passionate when you do it if you truly want to like.
I
break
mean,
down
it's
the
not
structure.
prescriptive, but it's an argument about the solvency of the alternative, yes.
Okay,
People show their passion in different ways. You can't really set a model for what that looks like.
but passionate.
Right, but I would suggest the one that sees passionate.
Okay, that's cool. That's real cool. I guess my other argument is, so is the King argument just that we didn't say anything about coloniality? Or
No,
like
you
that?
should look first to the piece of Smith evidence on that question.
Okay, what is this? So like
So
with
you
the
can
ad,
filter the access to the King evidence from the Smith evidence. I'm going to make the argument. The Lind argument essentially is that y'all are contesting the gap between what settler democracy performs and what it promises. That kind of anti-racist politic just seals the state and domesticates it.
And just trying to fix a settler state, which is fine.
oh, okay. Cool. You mind if I hold on to this?
No, you good.
Y'all have that?
Let me sit down.
That's probably smart. And
And I don't have a flashlight.
so I'll leave the flashlight.
Wait, I need the flash drive.
You good?
Yeah.
Can I get that flash drive?
Oh, y'all are done. Yes. Did you hand it back to me?
Yeah, I did.
I put it right here.
Are you looking for it?
Yes, I'm looking for it.
Oh, is that the way that we know the time started?
Yeah.
Okay.
So do we get 3:30 per school or 3:30 as a?
Around.
Okay.
You know it's going.
Well, she has it.
It also makes your saving feel really hard.
Oh, yeah.
I'll get that.
See, it makes you more confident. That's the way.
Yeah.
This one is got it, it's returning, their
Oh, you need the
road mapping portion today. John Delmore thought I was joking when I said I played music for lunch.
Did you save it in the round 4 folder?
No, it's just on the flash drive.
Yeah, we're fine.
It's also round 3, so that would.
Yeah, it's
Oh.
round 3 there too.
I thought it was
It's
wrong.
all good.
That's my bad.
It's all, I know, space neutrality, it's all good.
The discussion will always should feel for your thoughts about the one I see being a good idea or not. Oh, doing the basic speak for a sexual application. I realize that, especially when it comes about, especially in the context of theater, we want to see take a stance about our community. There's a shit ton of pot smokers that exist within the status quo. It's just devastating. That should filter the empirical lens about the amount of people who could possibly go to jail right now in the status quo. The prison industrial complex is the total population management. That's internally to all of our pre-care opposite in the case of the structural violence of the system. The structural violence of the system that is deemed certain lives as valuable and conditioned to live second class life, access to education, healthcare, in the real world, and no basic human rights within the prisons themselves. It's the view that these populations are disposable that justifies the racist system that put them there. And our evidence to get the prisons is logical expectation. We chose marijuana as a start point because it should be at the chain. The way we made our policy to use that there's also ironic just having considering that more states that are already considering this more states that already legalized it for colorblind reasons. That's our more acronym, but simply indicates that this is the type of reflexivity that we need to the war on justice rooted and connected to an oppressive power structure. A point of analysis is pedagogical interrogation, a challenge of foundations, the need to bolster support for all anti-racist news. Our political method is needed to recenter on the discourse on issues of racial relation in relation to our lived experience. This is needed for action outside the background, especially on hashtag normalize. This indicates that we all share an ethical commitment outside of this background because we are the future think tank writers, lawyers, writers, researchers, things of that nature. So it's how we pedagogically align ourselves. And your framing for this round should be who best performatively and methodologically acts as an organic intellectual debate. This is exactly best because our what I see is technological political discourse is an empowering education that spills over. We face institutions in the status quo. The what I see is a mechanism that opens the space for interrogation to college policies. The alternative, the alternative can wish away things like the prison industrial complex or police brutality or the laws that justify them. But we are not impeding on the alternative. We're in parallel because in debate rounds becomes a question of how we can even reorient ourselves in spaces like the classroom. We can protest, we can speak out, we can do that. This is the one I see is a unique disruption of the colorblind policies within the status quo, especially in the context of education. Education is present within itself because the obfuscation of the violence that occurs to minority populations. To use debate as anything less than pedagogical training ground is to legitimize the abuse and hero strategies they have real effects on real lives. This is necessarily key to discussions about liberation because it's liberation from tangible material struggles. This is so very talking further than the transformation of public money into private funds and the unavailable extension for public research and facilities that supplement families and individuals in the crisis before they can go to conflict without the brutal impact of community families and community of color and to the strong grassroots movement and plethora of organizations, lobbyists, the activists, grassroots, and student group movements. These groups can focus on a large range of enterprise issues, including the war on human rights violations inside of the prison with themselves. Activists, intellectuals such as Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Ramon Abercrombie, Linda Evans, Kimball Smith have played key roles in analyzing the prison industrial complex. Activists and women who play hard work for community organizing and provide support for diverse communities become part of a collective movement. They must be unified in the common understanding of Parliament shared vision of the possible solution of affirming visions beyond the comparative, dualism. We're interested in challenging what we see happening. Also, building a different world for the vision of anything meaningful in the communities of colors and individuals suffer from over-policing and incarceration must be accompanied by practical solutions that promise short-term and medium-term successes. That means developing practical strategies and small steps to move towards making our dreams a reality. And this first transforms people's consciousness that they believe that there's that believe that their own visions for different world of high school and secondary practice have been taking practical steps to oppose the prison industrial complex that works that involve steps to build on one another. That is the ultimate goal of de-shrinking. And there is, the one is an example of the structural violence that goes on in the prison industrial complex. Our radical vision is in parallel with the alternative support of decolonial thinking, because we are interested in dismantling and delegitimizing institutional racism. Start with the intersection versus war and drug policy. That's because this is specifically where Asha Hayden Armland evidence outlines, because this is colored by ideology and the structural position that put them in. One sees a resistance strategy to the social media that there are three internal links that should justify her imputation to both herself as correct and whiteness. They can see the functionality and when they see the communities of color, don't believe there's a serious problem with the prison industrial complex or rest of the plan is a way to force confrontation with these issues by forcing them into discussion. That's our more likely evidence. And two is epistemological ignorance. What's implicit in policy must be explicit in practice. We specifically critique and point out the racist policies, otherwise people think that racism ended with the 14th Amendment. This paraphrasing epistemological ignorance is the way and is why we must combat these sort of things in the status quo. It's Australian Armand in the 30s of resistance mechanism. How we choose to educate our movements how we choose to educate our movements is key. Legalization is coming out for colorblind reasons. Rehabilitation is a demand needed to ensure that the racialization of black body will stop. This is our Australian Armand, and it's an indicator that we have to change the way that we think about it, the way that we think about it first, especially that indicate that this is settler colonies. However, all the analysis of prison being a classroom is key to answer practice, and we are not a simple reform. We have radical vision abolition, especially at Shepherd Heath, evidence specifically outlines this sort of thing only in a world in which we can critique these things and we break it down, which is the outline of Shepherd Heath, outlined by Shepherd Heath evidence, and then they indicate that we're a state of exception. But however, we are not a state of exception with it. We have just explicit demands on how we want to specifically change it. And then the methodology of the one is not mutually exclusive with our position of the one right way to do politics exemplary to the internal conflicts that destroy community building and reflection. And this is player and those six prevailing racial activist like movements in the way we treat another internal conflicts and journalism. Whole movements back then more than the state of oppression and the internalized violence often replicates in our own circles. Misconception of the right way to do politics with that change and destructive form, at least the frustration, disillusion, isolation, social justice movements, strive for social change based on justice, equality, respect, and accessibility. We actually have to train ourselves to work hard at modeling the values and the ways in which we organize. And there's a couple of adds to the alternative. First off, legalization inevitable. So that means that's a question of how we orient ourselves towards these sort of movements. That's our more document. The second is the militarization of the police and marijuana laws are the go-to stop and first mechanism. That's an archetype evidence that indicates it's the largest part of our drugs because it is justified. It is a justified surveillance mechanism. There is a prison industrial complex. The alternative, it cannot solve for this. That means that it cannot break the cycle of violence that exists within the status quo. And then hyper-incarceration. Oh yeah, and also permutation due both our methods of decolonial thinking, only in the form of thinking that catches us from the combined norms that we've been placed in by white elites, recreated space of thinking that access inside and outside to make the scope. This is the way to be successful by hearing the cry of the damned. Otherwise, we're prone to error replication. This is Robertson, Kimball, 14. The object that one point can literally alter what one sees or doesn't, and certainly in the case of discussion about the environmental degradation where scientists continue to operate within a Western normative framework, and certainly the case of the efforts of the Western left, which propose alternative political economic deterrency and our consent to capitalism and state socialism. We will not succeed if we continue to treat the Western race from the non-Western to the interior space and our debates on our terms of what I have in order made in the conversation about any civilization. Decolonial thinking will need to include the Chinese feminist, African phenomenology, tendency theory, liberation theology, philosophy, and dialogues. As a site and a source of epistemic or shifted geography of reason, what matters where somebody's pronunciation is located, what the body speaks from, what the community they need to address ahead of the heterogeneous body of works is produced by being colonial figures, what we can see as explicit efforts to access world knowledge of the biases, concepts of universality, and the yield pride of the place of plurality and diversity, ontological difference to colonialism being a gender trouble to coloniality of gender. Decolonial knowledge production is opening up and rethinking, thinking and acting from different worlds. A decolonial term possession to shift the methodological choice in the side of intervention and the penal system works under. Yeah, they say their alternatives to decolonize, but however, abolition was the one they see from the beginning. And their their king evidence even calls for this in the round that says that abolition and diminishing prisons has to be part of any decolonizing framework which justifies permutation the plan. And then the Trucking gang evidence, our Oshkosh evidence specifically outlines this because Kentucky specifically talks about how the university is parasitic, but the Oshkosh and all this is why we have to be in the university. wherever we would be in the university to challenge things like the political pundits and the norms that seek to exclude questions of race and racism, and then he indicates me the state has rejected black people as property. But however, our adult evidence specifically indicates why that is the prison industrial complex. The 13th Amendment specifically indicates why they necessarily a form of chattel slavery. It's a form of chattel slavery right now in the status quo. And mass incarceration, how mass incarceration is also an attempt to reinstate racial hierarchies right now in the status quo. So there's only a risk of the one AC would soften the city yesterday. They indicate that government crackdown would happen, but however, I should tell you, evidence. I think this work was done above that indicate that marijuana is the primary go-to driver, meaning that it sets a precedence for the other drugs, means that it sets a precedence for the other drugs. You should call for it. It's a good piece of evidence. And they indicate that the permutation solves the morning of death, but however, permutation, let's have a moment of silence for the morning of death.
Before we start CX, could I grab that evidence back from you?
Yeah.
Cool. 3.
Ready?
Yeah, I'm good.
What is your perm text?
Huh?
What do you mean in your perm? You said perm means do both. What does that mean?
So I don't necessarily think a decolonial thinking perspective is mutually exclusive with the 1AC. I think the Robinson and Carback evidence.
Neither do I agree.
And I think too, we've taken a position to challenge the institutional structures where we would both be able to exist in this space together. So i.e. like when Ostertag and Armline says we have to speak from our lived experiences, we make a couple arguments that indicates why that's not necessarily bad in the status quo because of the way that the institution has been structured and things of that nature. So
is that it?
What do you mean?
That's all your perm context is?
Well, I think, and then I've outlined a couple of reasons why that would be good,
That's fine.
like a confrontation
There's
of
also
whiteness.
No. It's also the
There's
next
a moment of silence, permutation.
The moment of silence.
Right. Okay, so you say legalization is inevitable, and it's a question of how we orient ourselves towards that legalization. What do you mean by that?
So
And
this
why do
is
you think
why
that solves?
this is why the justification for our plan text, like why discussion should have to be around communities of color, because I think Ostertag makes a couple of claims how we inform public discourses because we are future writers, we're future think tank writers, things of that nature. So it's how we orient ourselves towards those things. Colorblind reasons in the status quo. We interject.
Kind of
those questions
sounds to
of
me
race.
like reorienting ourselves around the way the U.S. government will change, and then making it try to suit us when we all know that won't work. But okay. Like I said, you said the third is the prison industrial complex. The alternative reason to assess the levels that feed the how do we refuse to acknowledge the levels in which the prison industrial complex is like?
I think if the internal link to our Ostertag evidence is the and our Sudbury evidence is the grassroots activism that comes from it, because from things like debate, we learn how to advocate for different things, and then we take that into the world and do them.
Is the prison industrial complex the only form of population control on Turtle Island?
But it's
Oh, we
bad.
did not. Yeah, we just indicate
It's
why it's
bad.
bad. We did not isolate that as the only form.
So solving for the prison industrial complex does what inevitably?
Well, I think
I think
you,
we outlined a couple of impacts why that.
but I also feel like you misconceptualize the app. Our argument is that we have to change the way that we think and the way that we act. We have to reorient ourselves, starting with the classroom, starting with the prison industrial complex, because it's bad. Huh?
Why starting with the classroom?
Because also, like, I think I've articulated the reason why the classroom is also a site of prisons, because of the way that it obfuscates over questions of race and racism.
So you're not advocating for sending people of color into the classroom to learn these things, or
Well, see, like,
what are you
think
talking about?
I think the classroom is always there, right? Like when your mom talks to you, it's a classroom.
And part of the spillover argument is like we do advocate for these people we teach in our respective universities, other younger high school debate teams that we coach, things of that nature.
Right. I'm sorry, I have a quick question. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. You say in your winter evidence, I believe, We will not succeed if we continue to read Western writers only. White writers from the non-West who enter our debates on our terms will not have to be remain within the comfort zone of the civilization. Huh?
Okay, wait. I read Robinson and Carcall.
Oh, no, that's it. Yeah, my bad. Yeah, go ahead. Same question, just different author. What does that mean?
Like,
What is it?
one more time.
You say we will not succeed if we continue to read
Because
Western
it talks
writers.
about like normative, it talks about like normative frameworks, which is what I think our app is a critique of.
Yeah,
It talks
but you
about
also say
things like, it talks
authors-
about things like capitalism, it talks about things like the state, which I
But you also say writers from the non-West who enter our debates on our terms. What does that mean?
Well, I think that would probably mean that like the people that re-entrench Western thought by just assimilating to Western thought should not do that. Like people,
re-entrench Western thought by assimilating to Western thought.
no, you could be able to correct them.
I'm sorry, I just don't know what that means exactly.
I presume it's mean
We're
like
prepping now.
within the normative frameworks.
Alright, we got that. Alright. So,
Doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Cool, we can stop prep. That's 3:45. Which should be 6:15 now? Is that right? 6:10. Cool. Not in order.
wait, there's no order?
No, you could just go straight down.
Oh,
That's how I'm feeling, just straight.
other card?
Huh?
Other card?
Yeah, there'll be a couple of cards.
Okay.
Like one or two round two cards. Cool. Sounds good.
We probably solved their role of the ballot as far as organic intellectualism goes, but we have a couple of diss-ads to their performance. They are attempting to just inject themselves into public discourse, which is not fundamentally challenging to the foundations and siete of the 1AC. You have conceded that you challenge the gap, or you aspire to challenge the gap between bodies that are valued and those that are not valued, which means that your hope in settler society to be able to change is precisely the link the 1AC is seeking, incorporation into the nation state and society as a solvency mechanism for their discussion, but that is not in any way destabilizing to colonial centers of power. It just hermeneutically seals the state from anti-colonial organizing and protest. This does two things. First, it allows for the state to market itself as diverse or multicultural, which is a fucking problem. But secondly, it casts anti-racist struggle as contesting the gap between what settler democracy promises and what it ultimately performs, which is the piece of Smith evidence that we are reading. This has three impacts. First is the domestication of black struggle, that within this paradigm, Africa becomes ontologically colonized and people become represented as always being internalized external threat to the existence of the government in the first place. The second way that this happens is, or the second impact is that you cast Native people as internal minorities that should aspire to talk about the state. This is an erasure of competing sovereignty claims and fails to understand the settler state's ongoing complicity in genocide of Native people, which means that we are always going to be invisibilized in your project. The third impact is that you are a denial of the transnational character of resistance, that you are seeking a democratic discussion and inclusion and representation ultimately in USFG politics. You are seeking to change the way in which settler democracy disenfranchises Black and brown people, but that is exactly our argument, that this democracy is not capable of reflexing itself to be able to include you, which means that the settler slave estate is able to maintain supremacy and is sealed from threats to its existence like red and Black radical resistance. I'm going to answer the permutation explicitly now. We are impact turning. There are three reasons why the permutation is good. The first is that whiteness is an insufficient frame. That's the piece of Smith evidence that we're reading. She talks specifically about how we have to understand colonization as sort of like the prior question to whiteness, I guess, because it's what allows for the condition of the settler state in the first place, which means it is not just a question of racial hierarchy, but rather a question of how colonialism presents both Black struggle and Native struggle as internal, inevitably internal to the United States. The second argument, or their second argument, is literally the link argument, because you say you want to point out the differences between policy and practice. That is exactly the fucking argument, that when you point out that difference, when you contest that gap, you are ensuring the inevitability of the state, which means that you are merely pointing out racism. This assumes that privilege is a result of ignorance and not of ontological positioning. This means you are engaged in a process of subjectification in which you attempt to become human, but you can never reconcile the way in which Black bodies are ontologically positioned. That's the piece of King evidence that we are reading that talks about the way that settler colonialism operates as a disciplinary discourse of the landscape in order to discipline Black bodies, which means that you have to have an anti-colonial project. The third argument is about resistance education is good. We say, yes, resistance education is good, but we are impact turning your education because our piece of Smith evidence, as well as the Tuck and Yank evidence, indicates that decolonization is the only rubric through which we can paradigmatically understand how that decolonization has to happen. Further, they try to justify the permutation by being like legalization can lead to decolonization, but we already have answers built into this fucking argument. One, they are not reading the piece of King evidence that talks about prisons accurately, because that piece of evidence is specifically talking about abolishing prisons as part of a larger decolonizing method. If we are winning this Smith argument, this Smith link about contesting the gap, then this means that they are only reifying and hermeneutically sealing the state, which means that they cannot have an anti-colonial form of resistance because they are sealing the state as a hermeneutic that we have to appeal to within the politics of recognition that is never going to provide for Black people or Native people in the first place. Tuck and Yank is also a good answer to this permutation, and I'm going to read a new card. Tuck and Yank 12. Two distinct but overlapping tasks. The first concern with how the invisibilized dynamics of settler colonialism mark the organization, governance, curriculum, assessment of compulsory learning. The other concern with how settler perspectives and worldviews get to count knowledge, research, and how those perspectives are activated in order to rationalize and maintain unfair social structures. We've been thinking about what decolonization means, what it wants and requires. The language of decolonization has been superficially adopted into education and other social sciences. Planting ways of talking about social justice, critical methodologies, or approaches which decenter settler perspectives. Decolonization, which we assert is a distinct project from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects, is far too often subsumed into the directives of those projects with no regard for how decolonization wants something different than those forms of justice. Settler scholars swap out prior civil and human rights-based terms to signal the significance of indigenous and decolonizing theorizations of schooling and educational research, and to include indigenous peoples on the list of considerations as an additional special ethnic group or class. A startling number of these discussions make no mention of indigenous peoples, our struggles for recognition of our sovereignty, or the contribution of indigenous intellectuals and activists to theories and frameworks of decolonization. There is often little recognition given to the immediate context of settler colonialism on North American lands where many of these conferences take place. This kind of inclusion is a form of enclosure, dangerous in how it domesticates decolonization. It's also a foreclosure, limiting in how it recapitulates dominant theories of social change and metaphor, invades decolonization. It kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters white. It's a resettles theory, and it extends innocence to the settler. It entertains a settler future. Decolonize the verb of decolonization now cannot easily be grafted into pre-existing discourses and frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racism, even if they are justice frameworks. The easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonization is yet another form of settler appropriation. Decolonization is not a swappable term for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Decolonization does not have a synonym, which means that the permutation can never fucking function because you have already sealed the state, which is why you think these forms of legalization are always going to be inevitable. Our argument is that we should do work that is in solidarity with other organizations. We'll get to in a second. Also, the Robbins and Carcroft evidence that you read flows negative because we are already the dark side of decolonization. Also, this piece of evidence, the last line says, it is a decolonial impulse that motivates the work of scholars such as Taylor and Vasquez as they investigate how artistic and spiritual practices or movements can contribute to decarceration and rolling back of the prison industrial complex in the United States, which is an argument as to why we solve the affirmative. They don't have an argument as to how they get out of the way in which they have locked us into contesting the gap in 1AC cross-X and in their framing of the 2AC, contesting the gap between what settler democracy promises and what it provides. Also, the moment of silence term is literally like 1 second of silence. They need to weigh that 1 second real heavy. I don't know what they're about to do about that. That shit is ridiculous. Also, that term probably links to the stuff above. It doesn't make sense in a context where we're turning to education. Next, you can extend our pieces of King and Smith evidence. They talk about the ontological relegation of blackness within settler colonial disciplinary power. Black bodies and lands are cast as the internal property as the United States, which means that the affirmative is merely a misdiagnosis of the problem. There are two link levels here. This is baggage that your discussion is always going to carry. One, that you are trying to improve settler society to make life more settled, to improve the law and legal apparatus in order to perfect the settler state and society. But two, that you are trying to make democracy work better for black people and increase equitable distribution of resources. You admit in CX that you want to challenge the gap between the valuation of certain bodies and the bodies that are not valued, which again is the subjectification link argument that I'm going for. The alternative is decolonization. It is the only thing that is able to actually get rid of prison apparatuses and deal with the impacts of policing that are happening in the status quo. The work that we are doing is in solidarity with organizations like Insight. Tiffany King is specifically writing about the Insight ceremony work that she was engaged with, that she says was able to motivate her organizing that she did outside of Insight in order to help form coalitions between black and red people. This piece of evidence is specifically talking about the residual tensions that underlie black-red potentials for coalition building and the way in which indigenous frameworks have to fundamentally shift, which is exactly the process that the 1AC or the 1NC is engaged in, because it is that shifting of how indigenous sovereignties come to articulate themselves through which we are able to articulate an anti-colonial project that is able to abolish prisons and that understands the contingency or not the ontological status of blackness. Also, you can extend our Tuck and Yang evidence that talks about the ethic of incommensurability. Tuck and Yang are talking about how we cannot substitute black people and native people when we're talking about colonization, but rather we have to acknowledge the prior theft and ongoing theft of the land as a means of dealing with these things. Our decolonial struggle is a global project that does not make people happy or ensure coalitions. It is premised on a phenomenon analytic that rejects the nation state as a model, as well as the colonial internalization of the black struggle and indigenous people through processes of property making of black bodies and native lands. Yeah, cool. This is Gomer 13. Embodied geographies thus become pivotal to addressing decolonization projects. Native feminists can play a major role in our thinking about the connections between land individuals and construction of nations' bodies that are differently marked through gender, race, sexuality, or nationality, articulate differently different spaces native bodies travel. They have a differently less experience with realities that are constantly shifting the body, never to separate spaces connected to other indicators they use to regulate power. For indigenous people traveling through constructed colonial and imperial spaces, the body can be hypervisible, the abnormal body at times hyper-invisible, as it becomes spatially disjointed from the nation state and citizenship. The subject roles that come to being also have to perform a self-regulating mechanism in a field of surveillance. Instead of ingesting the normal removal native women, we open up the possibility of remapping America's indigenous land by rethinking dominant discipline narratives, also critically examining how we become self-disciplined colonial subject to justice is embodied. It is therefore always spatial, which is to say part of the process of making place focus on the gender body. These texts provide sight through which we can examine the gendered, sexualized, and racialized differentiations in relation to imagined geographies that buttress colonialism and enact violence in our daily life, which is a reason why they have to be articulated this from a criticism of settler colonial space. Cool. There you go.
What is the criteria to be able to effectively de-link yourself from Western thought?
I don't think I ever said those words or made that.
I mean, I'm just asking. You say decolonization is a better method, and I'm saying, what is the standard
Well, you're
for
still
decolonization?
you're still acting like it's thought.
I mean, that's my question. I'm asking.
But
Was it just the performance unity?
The Tuck and Yang evidence is about how decolonization is not thought, right?
So
About how it's not just like, let's decolonize
So what is
things. Sure, so Tuck and Yang make the argument that it's a specific spatial practice
spatial practice that looks like what?
that looks like overthrowing the state.
That looks like overthrowing the state. Okay, cool. What about our 1AC is the state?
Well, it's not necessarily that you are the state, right? Because you changed your context for this debate, but actually what it is that your contention is that we have
Contention.
Like your contention,
So
what you
is this
say
a
in the
call for-
1AC
so
is
is
that you have to negate like the gap or whatever, destroy the gap, contest the gap
So my question-
between how
let's ask
policy
you about
happens
it.
and what
Let's ask you
policy
about the
says
gap.
and the
Okay,
practice of it, which
That's
is
fine.
racist.
That's fine. I'm asking about the specific gap. What is that gap? It's that,
Well,
I understand that
y'all
it's what
want-
democracy promises and what you actually get. My next question is, how does your pedagogy spill over outside of the realm?
Presumably in the same way that yours does, our shit is being
I-
live
I
streamed.
have a-
I also
I
have
have
the
a-
articulation that we're working in solidarity with
I have
the
a-
scholars that we're reading
I have a
through
different
organizations like Incite Women of Color Against Violence.
I guess I have a different question, right? Like, I have a different question. You, a couple of times within the speeches, allude that like we see a gap and we're trying to fix that gap. Specifically, what part of the 1AC sees the gap, and then where are we trying to fix the gap?
Well, sure. So in CX of the 1AC, right, where literally I'm like, I said this intentionally. I was like, you want to contest the gap between which bodies are valued and which ones are not, right? And you're like, yeah, we want to contest that gap. You're also talking about this sort of like injection of lived experience into the public sphere. Also, the second thing that you say on the permutation is the epistemic ignorance, and then understanding the way that policy and practice play out differently. That's exactly, literally our argument with the piece of Smith evidence, right? That
So,
contesting the
we
gap
also-
between how policies are written and then the racist
That's
way that they're enacted ensures the
Okay,
universality of the state.
That's fair. I understand that portion of it. The Oshkosh evidence indicates that we are like an activist portion because of the ways that we relate from places like debate outside.
Sure, you may
I don't
be
understand.
activists. My argument is that your activism is bad because it has locked you
So what is
into
the
the
distinction?
state.
So what is the
Wait,
distinction
wait,
between
here's
your activism and our activism? That
Well,
doesn't
we're
make any sense.
transnational activism. You are.
How about this? How about this? How about this? How we talk about lynchings if we can't talk about the way that the law is supposed to be good for Black people, but always lynches them?
Because you can talk about that as a
Yeah,
ontological form of violence rather than being like the law says that people shouldn't be lynched.
The fact that
That's
you're seeing-
exactly the argument.
The fact that you're seeing that there are
So-
possibilities in which the law could negatively affect Black people is problematic because this law was never built for us. We can't see possibilities in this law, in this system structure. You understand?
Oh, yeah.
Just give me 1 second, sorry.
God, you took my pen.
Yeah, because mine got. Yo. Thanks, Steph.
Okay, stop writing.
And it used private.
Everyone ready? The act is exceedingly mistaken in terms of their solvency and what they think they do and how they think they can do it. Solving for the numerous arrests of Black people over small marijuana arrests doesn't do as much as you think it does. You limit it there. Black people are still being arrested for false charges of burglary, assault, aggression, publicly being Black, privately being Black, visibly being Black. Legalizing marijuana doesn't do that. Marijuana will not decolonize America. They have this utopian view of this state and how great it can be. Any articulation of a perfect America for Black and Indigenous people is only an attempt to reconstruct this nation, which is problematic. America is a good idea for white people, and you cannot reconstruct this democratic, free society for people of color because we know for a fact that it was never built for us. You cannot use the master's tools to deconstruct the master's house. Our civilizations, we all know that before colonization, our civilizations in Africa and here in Native America, our civilizations exercise freedom in truly free societies. In Africa, there were no words for prison because nobody stole because everyone had food. There were no words for orphanage because we didn't throw away our children. There were no words for old folks home because you didn't throw away grandma and grandpa. We look at these institutions as privilege. We look at these institutions as prisons. We look at these institutions such as orphanage and old folks homes. We look at them as privileges and gifts from the state and forms of protection given to us by the USFG. But in actuality, they just point to how the structure is flawed. What do you think of when you see when you know that you live in a nation that has an agency to combat homelessness? What do you think of when you know that you live in a nation that has an agency to combat hunger? What do you see when you look at a nation that has an agency for everything that's flawed in society, that was a direct result of the society that's a direct result of the colonization that is inherent in the society. Why do we have these structures? Because white people have viewed that certain people are expendable and fungible within the United States system, but also it's not just limited to the U.S. It's a transnational analysis of what of spaces that have historically been viewed as fungible and therefore expendable. Now we see that whiteness is deemed certain places such as Africa as property and therefore it's fungible, and that the people that live in these geolocalities are therefore useless or useless unless they're under certain labor conditions. But at the same time, we see that that the app is trying to reconstruct this system that is never going to be, that it can never benefit us. We've seen in the past that any attempt to engage through legal strategies in the United States federal government is inherently wrong, and it only further demarcates Black bodies. We've seen this with the abolition of slavery and how it led to the Jim Crow era. We've seen this with the attempt of Black people to try to engage through the courts rather than through voting or through legal processions. But we see it in court with the Dred Scott decision that conditions only get worse because whenever Black people try to engage in the state or try to figure out ways to make this state work for them, the government just finds ways to further exclude Black people from the state. In addition to Native bodies and how Native bodies made a claim to this land and said, okay, this is our land, we negotiated treaties with you, we expect you to honor those treaties. Once again, you're expecting the U.S. government to you're expecting people to contest the gap between what is promised and what is actually given. When Native Americans said, okay, we signed these treaties and we expect you to honor them, instead they saw these treaties and they tore these treaties up and said, okay, we don't really owe you anything. We're going to move you. You want land, we're going to give you land. We're going to move you to certain parts of the Americas and we're going to contain you there and then we're going to kill you there. We all know through the Trail of Tears that there was an extreme biological warfare played when they put smallpox in blankets and gave them to the Native Americans to kill them off on I don't know exactly the miles of it, but cross-state trek towards Oklahoma, by which many Native Americans died of exhaustion and died of lack of food and resources because of the forced pilgrimage. So we see that any attempt to engage in the state is inherently problematic, and therefore the app is not a good idea. Now, the Alders is a form of decolonial analysis, structural analysis that one solves for the prison industrial complex, because we acknowledge the ways that the prison industrial complex is a problem, but we don't just limit it to legalization of marijuana. We say that an overhaul of the entire United States federal government is necessary in order for Black people and Native people to gain a certain type of humanity that is needed in order to engage in civil society, and what is deemed civil is now is also problematic. We can't expect to engage in a civil society that deems these certain things as which is imbued with categories of whiteness. So any attempts to reconstruct civil society are problematic in itself, which is why the alternative is call for a spiritual mobility by which not only we mourn those that pay homage to those that have died because of this inherent violence in the structure, but also it's a way of rejuvenating ourselves, because it gets fucking exhausting coming here and argue the ways that the American government is inherently violent towards people of color, queer bodies, and women. And literally, we have nothing else but that, except for the fact that we're up in here. We all agree that we're up in here in debate, and that pedagogy is important in debate. But when people don't want to listen, what do we have to do? We have to keep finding ways to keep coming back to this space. This space is exhausting. It's toxic to us, and spiritual mobility is one way of combating that. Their perm is there really isn't no perm, because they said the decolonial structure, the decolonial analysis coming out of the alt is not mutual, is not really exclusive, isn't really co-constitutive to what they're arguing. If they're not a decolonial, if they're not a decolonial analysis, then what really are they solving for? Because deconstruction of colonization in America is a prerequisite before any engagement of Black people trying to engage in the state and reform law for the benefit of Black people, because we all know that this shit won't work out for us in the first place.
How much time?
I slept last year.
Did you use prep before the 2 AC?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like 30 seconds.
30 seconds, yeah, it was like.
Oh, yeah, you did. Okay, stop right. 7:15.
Yep.
You know, when you told me about the flashcard thing, I kind of laughed in my head because I was like, you know what? I'm never gonna have a speech where I have to give cards except this one. Oh yeah. Well, like I gave the one AC and I had to give the flashcard. I was like, man.
Any flashing cards?
Oh no, I'm just giving it back. And, the order's gonna be straight now.
Surprising.
Right. But like, starting with the app, like, and then.
Where's Firewall's ready to go?
Real quick.
Quick for 6 minutes.
You know, that can be quick in some people as well.
Why do I always do so quick?
That's what I always tell myself for the team. Alright, everybody good? She opens up by saying there's a disaster to our performance. I think there are a couple of disasters alternatives you don't solve or anything. That is a high threshold for alternative solvency coming out of the one. A R, don't give them the new articulation in the two and I don't exactly know how decoloniality will actually solve for the system of anti-blackness or solve for the prison industrial complex. But I do think the permutation probably resolves this discussion better, and I do think they've articulated why the permutation is somehow why the app is somehow mutually exclusive with the question of spirituality. I think that they don't have an articulation of that, then you're probably going to from it now. We're going to learn about a little bit more. She says that you do organic intellectuals from I think either A, you're like us and you don't let me up into any part of the flow, or B, you don't need the organic intellectual flow here. It's what it takes to be an organic intellectual. 1, you need to be from the agree community. 2, you need to share the needs of the agree community. 3, you need to rupture hegemonic discourses. And 4, you need to build coalitions. This is the argument that says we are 1, build the coalition. 2, we are from that community that says that we are black and that we have to change the way that we live in this society. Now, there are a couple of questions. They have one link argument, one place where we don't have any options in this debate. This question of whether or not we are masking the USFT, whether or not we are smoothing it over. That's what you got into the wrong debate here or there. Is no one that's true about us. We are the rupturing. That's what we're looking for. The alternate evidence is the best piece of evidence in this round. You call for that in the debate because it says that we have to interject our own critical perspectives in these places in order for us to reject the notion that told us that we were taught to be black. We were taught to be the nigger. We were taught to be the savages. That we have to reject that notion and say that we have to teach our children differently. This is what they miss about the one they see. I guess you told me where that fake spinning gas out. We are now being sent to I think it's important that we should center these discussions about black bodies more popular evidence is the disaster, the alternative, because right now legalization is coming. It's never. You can see that question. It's only a question of how we orient ourselves towards that legalization, and that question says that we have to fight it. We have to realize that the state is going to do bad things. We have to train ourselves and teach ourselves that we can overcome them by working together as a community to fight and change our world. But that starts in the classroom. That starts with education. Now here is a bring it to the 2 and R. There is not only classrooms that come like universities, and not only in debate. It is the classroom that's what happened with your mother. Is the classroom that Manuel Torres is talking about. These are the places where we find that we have to change the way that we move forward, where we change the way that we think. Now they say that we hurt black people. This is they say we hurt black people. 1, our evidence says that we do the opposite. This is the ACLU evidence that says that 30% of black people go to jail because of marijuana possession, but also the marijuana possession is the way that they get thrown in jail. That was the Oscar evidence. They said that we force natives to be internal minorities. That's not our argument. Instead, we teach differently so that the reason that they were made into minorities can be overcome. That is the only way you can fight anti-blackness. So they say in my terms of the permutation, I think permutation can both solve best here because it's important for us to embrace this blueprint for how we decolonialize. They say we read the King evidence. We read the King evidence exactly how it's supposed to be. You have to break down principles because you can't have a free world in which there still stand principles. And the only way to break down principles is by starting to question the logic that allowed us to teach that principles were still legitimate. This is exactly exactly quote from the abstract evidence. That means the permutation problem solves. But also, they conceded that there is no one right way to do policy. That's the fire 06 evidence that says when we started with those other methods of policy, only entrenches coloniality. This is exactly argument and 100% turn on the alternative and I major that benefit to the permutation. They say coloniality the only way. Exactly the fire argument there. And they say all Christians have the longer message. That is what we were already doing. It literally said that in the abstract evidence. It says, and I quote, that we start breaking down the system of prisons as a place to put people and breaking down the question of that being legitimate because it is illegitimate, but that the reason it exists in the status quo is because past thinkers have thought of it as legitimate. The only way to change that is by producing better scholarship like the 1AC. Now they say we steal the state. We have not steal the state. We have broken the state by saying that we can teach the black community to be different. We can teach the black community to treat each other different, but also that goes over to the larger communities that are not only the black community. That's why the black text is not only about black people, but red, black, and brown. This is the concession that comes, and they have no response to this. So people are getting a lot of inroads to the permutation. They say ontological regulation of blackness. The argument is even if blackness is ontological, it's about the way that we interact with each other, the way that we treat ourselves, that way that we come up. That is an important question. It's not a question of how the state's going to treat us. Because you know what? We already knew there's no such thing as a paradise here for a black man. But what we do think is that we can teach ourselves differently. We can make our condition better by making our community better, by teaching our kids that better lives than we did. Now, they say they improve society. We don't improve the society. We make the society a wholly different one. When Wooderson calls for the culture to end the world, he's calling for a shift that is paradigmatic, but that shift is one that has to be ideological and something that happens in the classroom. You would never know about King if you didn't read her book, and I'm saying that we have to be those type of writers, and that is and their benefit to the permutation. They say natives are different. Yes, they are different, but the question that still exists is what is allowing for them to be abused. It's the foundational question of how they have been taught that they can be abused and how whites were taught that they can abuse others. Instead, we say that we have to teach differently. Now, they make a lot of arguments about how black people still go to jail. The abstract evidence solves this by teaching us differently, not to police black bodies, because we have to recognize that the black body was never really deviant, but that it was only taught to us to be deviant. Now, they say agency in society. Our argument here is that we may not be able to have agency, but we damn sure can have education. We damn sure can have a better life. Now, I have a couple more just actually alternative here. Was that Turner A part of the system, was Henry Tubman A part of the system, was Bertrand Douglas A part of the system? If your answer to these questions is no, then I think you want to vote for the term, because that's exactly what we are. We are educating the black community, but also other racialized communities on how we can come up and questioning the logics that would allow for us to be abused. Now, they say blacks can't be in the state. I think I've already done that work above. They say rejuvenate ourselves. That's our shit. They say no permutation because decolonization, not our analysis. We are the steps to decolonization because we have changed the way we think, we have changed the way we feel. And if you tell me I ain't bashing it, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, they say we have to overthrow the USFG. So I can't say that voting AF or YAG will do that, but I can say if you're trying to, the AF is probably the better way to do it. Perm, do both.
I have 5 10.
Yeah.
Is it the buyer evidence that you said is a net benefit to the commons?
Buyer, P-L-Y-E-R.
Cool, thank you. Is that in your ways?
It's a 2AC card.
P-L-Y-E.
Mm-hmm. I dropped my pen and looked after it. Right.
Cool, that's done. Cool. Is everybody good?
The endpoint of the affirmatives politics is democratic inclusion, that they are contesting the gap between what settler democracy promises in policy and how it practices. In actuality, we see this in CX of the 2NC when they're like, how are we supposed to talk about lynching without talking about how laws should have protected Black people? That is precisely our argument. This is the issue with your paradigmatic analysis and Smith's issue ultimately with most of Black studies, that we can talk about violence without appealing to the rights of citizenship and inclusion in civil society, because the politics of recognition is just going to be imbued with categories of whiteness, and reconstituting and reconstructing civil society to be more equitable is precisely the problem with your political orientation. Your expectation is that the law is going to benefit us, but we have to abandon that paradigm completely. There are three impact arguments to this that they are not dealing with well. The first is that you domesticate Black struggle because you are only appealing to a legal infrastructure that is built on an ontological disavowal in terms of the way in which property making occurs, which means that Black people are always relegated as being internal to the United States within this contestation of the gap. The second link argument is that you cast Native people as internal minorities. You say that you don't do that, and that your piece of buyer evidence somehow gains you access to the way in which you teach differently, but the buyer evidence is not linked to the negative. If anything, it links to the affirmative, because y'all say you want to teach differently, but our Tucking Gang evidence is specifying that you cannot just tack on decolonization or tack on Native people to an existing political infrastructure, because you have already relegated Native people to being internal minorities and disavow the power that Native people have in decolonization in the fucking first place. So I don't know how Native people are supposed to access or engage in the politics of the affirmative, other than that they have to appeal to the law in the various ways that they have positioned that Native people have to do. The third argument is that you are a denial of transnational forms of resistance, because the settler state and the state is always going to be sealed within your paradigm. You say you want to literally, in the 1AR, we want to break the state down. Black people are treated differently. This can spill over to the larger community. This is exactly the argument, that the language of racial difference is itself the link, because all you are doing is saying that Black people are not treated how white people are. But this appeal has already locked you into the first two dissad arguments, as well as hermeneutically sealed the state, because it means that kinds of resistance can only appeal to an existing infrastructure that is built off of the prior ontological disavowal of Black bodies and Native lands as always being property of that state in the first place, which means that you are only asking for settler inclusion in the first place. The idea that Indians are going to be internalized into another political project is exactly what I'm talking about. That is impacted out in the Tucking Gang evidence, because it means that the affirmative can never result in any kind of decolonization, because all they are doing is locking sovereignty of the U.S. within a domesticated, anti-racist framework that cannot challenge the settler state itself. This domestication of black struggle is precisely our argument that you have just bought into the ontological relegation of blackness within settler colonial disciplinary power as per the piece of King evidence. So your attempt to improve settler democracy is the fucking link argument. Also, which is all an answer to the permutation, right, and a disadd to the permutation, the reason why the permutation cannot function, and why prisons can only be abolished if you are engaged in a decolonial project. As per the piece of King evidence, she's specifically talking about in a ceremony she was engaged with incite women of color against violence that specifically articulates that organizing outside of the state is ultimately going to be better. Let's get to this organic intellectual shit. Okay, I'm Indian, I don't know how I'm not an organic intellectual. To me, this feels like authenticity policing and an erasure of my indigeneity because I look white, which is answered by the piece of Smith evidence, who says that Native peoples, by contrast, who are situated as potential citizens by our apparent proximity to whiteness, should not be understood as a pathway to freedom, but as a pathway to genocide. I don't know why Khalil and I are located as organic intellectuals too, because we are obviously harmed by the violences of colonialism and anti-blackness that are happening in the status quo. Our argument is that we have to be in solidarity with organizations like Incite Women of Color Against Violence, which does work outside of the political machinations of the nation state, so that black and brown women who are in sexual and domestic abuse situations don't have to call the cops and contribute to the prison industrial complex, but can instead be involved in community accountability strategies. This is our fucking argument. So when y'all say that somehow you are the only ones who have access to out-of-ground spillover or out-of-ground activism, we are making a specific articulation of the way in which the invocation of spiritual ceremony in this space is tied up in work that other activists are doing, which is exactly the kind of decolonial project that we are talking about in the first place. If both of us spill over, Vic, you could probably evaluate that debate as a wash, and then you can look first at the disadd that we have to their kind of educational practice because of the way they have situated both black people and Native people, and what that means in terms of how they have situated the state. Further, I'm going to answer this perm a little bit more because I really don't want them to be getting offense on a perm that doesn't fucking work. The first disadd to the permutation is the piece of Tuck and Yang evidence that talks about how we can't have decolonization just grafted on to another political project, right? Their political project is not decolonization. It is that we should have a discussion about the way that, and they add red bodies in this round, which was nice of them, but that we should have a discussion about the ways in which marijuana legislation, I guess, impacts and policing impacts black, brown, and red bodies. That is their act. You should stick them with their fucking act, okay? So if that is the articulation of the affirmative, that is not a decolonial project. That means that Tuck and Yang is merely being the language of decolonization is merely being grafted on to another anti-colonial project, which is just a move to settler innocence that you cannot vote for because that only reifies the colonial structures that exist in the state in the first place. The second disadd is a piece of Smith evidence that talks about how we can't be contesting the gap because they have already hermeneutically sealed the state, which means that they have no accessibility for ways that they can overthrow the state because they have sealed the state by being like, we have to contest the law. Rather than by being like, we should understand the ontological status of black and Native people and the ontological relegations of violence that happen to us, which is a better result.
All right, can I go to the bathroom? Because see, it's your prep time.
Right.
Yeah, but I didn't want to go right before my speech, and I want to prep kind of income.
You're just not during your prep time.
That's true.
Because really, we have no way of not knowing it's not prep time. Also, it makes the round longer, mostly.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, wouldn't the round have been equally long if she'd gone during her prep time?
No, because she would have gone during the 5 minutes the clock is already running.
Oh, but she went before she started prepping. So.
Right, so she stopped the clock. This is why debates take longer than they used to, because y'all don't think those things through.
Oh. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yes, fairness issues aside, like this is literally stopping the debate.
That makes sense. Do debaters still do that or no?
Hmm?
Like, are they those like take a long time, go to the bathroom all the time debaters, or are they like real we'll give speeches now?
My novices are figuring out how to debate still. All right, she's back.
Wait, oh, right, you're right.
But
How much
she's
is
back.
left?
7:50. I feel like Khalil can go during the 2-hour time. See how that works? Yes, it works.
3 hours, he's prepping for this.
With the oxygen control.
Is anyone else still debating in here?
Whoa, wait, there's a choice arc coming.
There's a whole speech coming.
Which one? Okay, I have yet to hear.
This is my debaters, he wrote these. The finals of Jamie Nats, we basically made one of the observers become voting. So your job is to stand. Because he was the only one who could get it to stand up.
Was it at least interesting?
The final?
Yeah.
That was great. We all had a lovely conversation about meetings and presidents.
Oh, God.
First off, there's no articulation of alternative and how it's also any of the case arguments, i.e. the prison industrial complex or the pedagogy. The one is simply this justifies permutation do both. Guess what? The only like articulation that I have is that we are complacent with the statistical state of exception. But however, there makes a couple of articulations that I think are going to become pretty damning on the slow, especially coupled with the secondary arguments. If you think actors like Huey P. Newton, revolutionaries became complicit with the state, if you think that actors like Huey P. Newton, Angela Davis, Ruth Africana, Linda Evans and Kimba Smith. All of them are organic intellectuals who have a vision of dismantling system as a whole. But it started with the prison industrial complex. This is not a notion that we are complacent and we are trying to domesticize Black revolutionaries. But it's a question about all we can do is one, acknowledge our own lived experience, but two, how do we operate with how do we orient ourselves? And the whole time the one I see is always stood by the fact that we are in discussion. We are not this post-fiat version of fair water legalization, which is going to become pretty damning. Our hashtag normally never specifically indicates why our mechanism, why the mechanism of the one I see is key to especially combat the legitimacy of racism within the discussions that take place. Specifically like discussions that take place. The one I see is a way to just delegitimize and confront the racist practices that exist within the status quo. Because, like I said, people do not think that there is an actual problem. That is the mechanism of the one I see that we only have to win. Then they indicate that we are just a category of civil society within things. I have no articulation of one. The alternative would be overcome the reconfigurations of civil society, but then itself, if that's the case, then that means that the permutation would be able to solve the next division. The only other dissent that they have is that native internal minorities, like this like teaching differences argument. Differences argument, but however, one I think that our okay. We did not tackle attack on decoloniality. We were already doing that. The alternative is displaying as a spirit of resistance and throughout. But however, Oshitech says that we can change that sort of thought pattern we can change that sort of thought pattern. There are no limits. What is this? There are no links to this argument, and also we have the best chance of solving for this because it's like the best chance of teaching relationships. And specifically, you can see this when it comes to things like what happens post outside of this, and what happens post outside of this debate round. When we have to confront certain things, what happened within the status quo, the overview that was the overview that was at the top of the 1AR specifically proves that, especially when there's people who smoke marijuana with this inside of the debate community in the status quo. It's like, what do we do in the face of those? The 1AC is a mechanism. Yeah, the 1AC is a mechanism of pointing these sort of pointing out the racial injustices that exist within the status quo. The racial injustices within the status quo is the educational teaching method. They also indicate that Native Americans don't have access to the law, but however, that's also our argument that Black people don't also have access to the law. But it's a question of how we orient ourselves. The 1AC was already more decolonization because it fits outside of the normative framework that indicates that people like Native Americans and Black bodies should not have educational opportunities or should be able to walk around free. Now they indicate that this is a denial of transgression argument. But however, this is a mapping argument onto the 1AC. The sub-area evidence specifically would take this out because it indicates that we have to rally around specific points of sensation and that meaningful communities and individuals that are suffering from things like over-policing and mass incarceration have to come up with practical solutions that will offer short-term respect that share the vision of seeing the system as non-existence, which is exactly why the permutation would be able to solve this. She indicates that we are resistant to ontological. We are resisting she says that we're resisting ontological pitting and that there's like native land use that we have, but however, all the ontological arguments are solved by the Oshitech evidence specifically indicate that we can only solve for lived experience. I can't talk for a Native American body, but I can't talk as a Black body, which is exactly the side of re-agency. That the Oshitech evidence is specifically talking about today. Indicates that the King evidence would indicate that the prison abolition. However, our Shepherd and Hughes evidence, but she indicates decolonization first, but she articulates no unique distinctions between like their specific decolonization method and method of the 1AC aside from this state of exception link, but there's no differentiation between their method as well. They did not do this work, and then they indicate that authenticity policing, but however, it's exactly where the player evidence comes into place because it says that there's not one way to specifically do politics, and we have to avoid things like combative dualism because that is the worst state repression because it's an internalized violence that will replicate itself inside of its own structures. Like the notion that there's only right way to eventually create change is exactly what leads to disillusionment and isolation that occurs within the status quo. And they indicate that the discussions, our discussions are written around weed, but however, the solidarity mechanism that's outlined in the sub-area evidence would be able to solve for this. And plus, we already answered the Tucking Yang evidence that indicates that the university is the space that we can only be in, especially when we're talking in the context of like racist practices, because of the ways that it's selectively filtered out those discussions from occurring in the first place. And they indicate that the Smith evidence that there's a gap over who has access to the status quo, but the question is also what happens when we leave outside of this debate round. If you think that the negative has to be complacent in those systems, and that's also a reason to vote articulation because they have no articulation about how they will overthrow the state outside of this round.
Can I see the Oshitech?
The Oshitech. Remind me of your name?
I'm Darian.
Darian.
Cool. Yeah.
Actually, there's a second option.
Do we have like 5 minutes?
Yeah. Yes. It's all about the marijuana, or smoking time, or visiting other people time.
black on the native sovereign kingdom?
It is the turn app is only a reach distribution. It is settler colonialism.
I think that's
Racist.
if it's not, then
Good thing I love the text of the cards. That was and then I see the type of one.
the one I read or the one Taylor?
The one that's thank you very much. You read the highlighted though, right? Not the unhighlighted, underlined. bold.
Let me see.
So like, you got some stuff that's like underlined and bolded, and then you got some stuff that's highlighted beyond that. Like, would you have read this?
It starts with California property.
That's what I thought. And so like anything down here that's like not in the sentence would be. You just read the highlighted words there, right?
Do you want me to just give you the version that I wrote?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because I mean,
Is
there's
it
some.
easier to email it?
Yeah, it'll be easier. Because there's.
It's Vicdebate, VIKDBATE.
Because they're like really similar, but
I think that's what it is, and I'm just, part of this is me just checking the words that were in the actual date.
definitely good.
Hide the words, and that makes my job. While you're doing that. I rarely call for cards, but when I do, I have my own account that can go into that they can color my account.
And it's Vic.
VIKDEBATE.
Mhm. Thank you.
Vicdebate@gmail.
Do y'all have the second page of our Smith evidence by any chance? It has a little highlighting.
I know I don't.
It's really short, just kind of at the top. I just don't know. And it's in. Is that it, the total like that? Well, this is the first page.
Maybe it's over there. I think.
I don't think I have it. I have King and I asked for Tuck and Yang and he gave me an extra King card. It's not at all what I wanted. But
Sorry.
oh, it's that.
It's like the pages under the top.
He handed it over. I was like, that's not the end of the Tuck and Yang card. I don't even know what that is. But it's got the same color highlighting.
Right.
That's
It looked like it went to Tuck and Yang.
She was Snapchatting.
I'm just typing. So I typed this out longer so you have as a reference, because I think that that becomes sort of important today. I end up voting negative, and I think that my issue is that I don't have the second dissad that they're talking about handled as well, which is the internal minority question. I just don't, your 2AR seems to kind of skip over that a little bit. You actually get to the third point a little bit faster, which is this argument that the way that your coalition process is articulating itself characterizes Native Americans as a minority within the United States in terms of the struggle, as opposed to this transnational coalition building that they're talking about, which is that it is a distinct nation that is engaging in this kind of oppositional, that discussing Native Americans as though they are part of this United States in the minority status isn't the same thing. And that's sort of one of the original links. And that's actually what her 2NC and her 2NR articulations are that I have coming out of that. The 2NR is sloppy. And so this is harder than it should be on that point. I also think that there is a issue in terms of the colonialization debate. I think you could have made yourself this easier on yourselves in the 2AC by cross-applying your, who is it? The Dawn and 12 evidence, the second card you read, the stuff that talks about neoliberalism, combined with the Ostertag means that the deconstruction of neoliberalism that's happening or out of the 1AC, plus your Ostertag evidence that talks about that kind of rejection that needs to happen, is a de facto rejection of decolonization. One of the questions that comes up is, how does decolonization solve for the prison industrial complex, right? Okay, that's the bottom of that second King piece of evidence. It's read in the 1NC, she extends it in the neg block. It literally says, if we adopt Native American sovereignty, the literal land the prisons are built on and the entire system ceases to exist. That's what their argument is.
Like capture all the, okay, so I have two questions to that. So one is like, how do you filter the player evidence then? Like, because I can't speak from a subject position of a indigenous person, which is like all the internal links to why that causes like intergroup conflict amongst each other.
I don't think that's entirely what the argument is, right? Their argument is that we have to just have a recognition of that status on settler land, right? It's not an issue that you have to identify in terms of Native American identity, is that you have to have a recognition in terms of lived experiences, what some of their King evidence talks about.
I'm confused on like
Yeah.
the methodology of decolonialization and
So-
how that translates outside of the debate space to being like everybody from United States, or everybody on indigenous land.
There's two warrants that are happening. They're coming out of the 1NC and the 2NC. The first warrant is coming out of that same King evidence, which talks about focusing on what does the specifics of this sovereignty question misses the point about it because of the issue that just rejecting that, the essence of that nation state in that context is important. And that warrant is also within that Tuck and Yang evidence that they're extending out of the original argument, right? That's where those two, I think that this just becomes a point where I have these warrants on the flow and being sent in. This is where I'm saying the 2NR is sloppy because they're not as well articulated in the 2NR as individual warrants, but the cards are clearly being extended that the arguments are based off of, and they're clearly set up in the earlier constructive debates, which is that this idea of how does that spill over is the first question, is not entirely the right question. And then the second issue is that she talks specifically about the ways that what King is doing in the spaces that she's engaged in, about bringing those coalitions together and having it's, the top part of that card talks about saying, when you ask these questions, what happens to us or where do we frame ourselves from, it becomes a question of, oh, recognizing, right, post-US, post the sovereignty question.
It seems like the distinction between like their coalitions and our coalitions is that we just didn't flat out say like we don't believe in the nation state. Like would that have been a better response?
Yes, in fact, it would have been that simple. And so one of the things I was typing out is that actually I think there's the fact that you're going to the Ostertag evidence, I think is the right thing. I just think you need to do a little bit more work on some of the two other internal warrants that were in that part. Because I do think that your evidence does support this. I understand why you don't think that these are competitive coming from your argument. It was just one of those, I think it's an articulation issue more than anything else. I think that if you talk about the space, so in the constructives, it gets a little fluky what you mean, because in the constructives, it's sounding more like a traditional policy justification almost of like, we're the future policymakers, we're the future lawyers in this space, we can re-educate them. It doesn't take that step away from the establishment in the way that they're kind of demanding, right? But I think you're making a really good 2AR articulation, this is coming out in 1AR, of this idea of no, we can reconfigure our entire relationship to those things, right? I just think the way I understand it out of the 2AC is slightly different than the way I understand it out of the 1AR and the 2AR. I think you can take that a step further and you can say, no, Ostertag is saying the entire system is terrible. What we do is a rejection of that system outright. It's not an endorsement of correcting the criminal justice system or making it better or inclusive, because that's what you're letting them get away. It's characterizing it for the first half.
I thought those were all the mapping arguments. It's like, that's, okay, maybe.
I think part of it is you let them characterize you a certain way in the first half of the debate. And so once we get into the rebuttal portion of the debate, while this becomes clearer, it's now been allowed, it hasn't been corrected out of the gate to some extent. So it becomes a little bit of how do I interpret that articulation? It also is a little bit problematic because honestly, it seems like there's more offense on your side in part because the 1NR isn't really generating any offense for the negative, right? And you have to kind of come to grips with this question, right? Your arguments about like, well, that doesn't solve for crack cocaine, whatever, like that's in their 1AC. They actually articulate that issue. They talk about some of these issues. So it's making the 1NR not as much offense for the negative, which means that they get to re-spin some of these arguments in response to the answers that you're making. And I think that that's part of how this evolves and why the negative is a little bit weaker in the final rebuttals at that point, right? Because there isn't that leverage put on the 1AR, because I think some of the arguments in the 1AR and the 1NR are creating that impression that there isn't really a distinction between what your opposition is. Do you know what I'm saying? Or do you want me to figure that? Okay. So I think that's part of also where the issue is coming from, right? Because you have this other piece of the flow where you get to like, that's exactly what we're talking about, and that's exactly what we're solving, right? And I think that that creates sort of the impression that things are closer, more closely aligned for you than they are at this original question on the question of sovereignty and who and citizenship and the way that they're framing that.
So my next question is like, how do you filter the Sudbury evidence then? And that's like talks about how like we can share a vision of the system being abolished at the end.
Two things. I don't have that as well articulated in the 1AR, honestly. Like I just don't. In fact, I had to like that some of that searching that I was doing is this is what happens when you have a interestingly flowed debate, right? Is me trying to figure out where arguments generated from and came through. I don't have that as clearly extended in 1AR. The second argument is that I don't think that's answering, because I don't have that answer as clearly in the 1AR, I don't have it as responding to some of the 2NC argumentation that's come out of that, right? Specifically, that when you originally bring that up in the 2AC, right, that's part of where her debate on those three dissat items articulate that even if you get to the same endpoint and you all agree that this is a rejection, right, if in that process you're sort of incidentally re-supporting the conception of either system, and also the idea that their evidence is very specifically talking about that for Black bodies in the United States, it becomes this question of if it is stolen land, but you are not part of the skilling process, where is the end result in that in a challenge to colonialism, right? And I think that might be a better way to sort of essentialize the point, right? When it comes to what she brought up about what does that mean from our point of the debate and our lived experiences. is that it becomes a question, the fact that people don't think that this is part of their lived experiences is actually the fundamental problem,
Okay, I see.
right? That everyone thinks that they are not somehow complicit in this, but any question about continuing to exist in this physical space becomes part of that.
I think I tend to shy away from complicity type arguments because I don't think Black people are settlers.
Right.
So but
But
I also
that's kind
feel
of how
what you're
your
saying.
but that's kind of how some of your king evidence is.
Well, and that's sort of how we would deploy, I hear you, like how we would deploy like the spatialization of things
Yeah.
In that context. That totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, and again, it's not so much, and it's that thing. They are not settlers, right? But there is also this recognition of what do we do in terms of the sovereignty issue and the colonialization issue of if you are not a settler and you are not culpable in that context, what is it that King is working for in
Right.
terms of that realization? That's
Right.
what the process is coming out of it.
So my next question
Yes.
is, how do we generate more offense off of their methodology if they don't explain?
I think there's a couple of things that you can do there. I think the first thing is what I said originally, like that Dawn, I think it's Dawn, is your author, right? Talking about like that you actually have a comprehensive methodology coming out of the 1AC, so that their methodology of recognizing and rejecting, right, and the alternative decolonialization. I cannot speak. I like need water desperately. My tongue is getting tied. That you've already precluded that by looking at the forces that drive the colonialization process and create the structures. I think also talking about how your authors are saying that from your position, the fight that you should be doing is the legal system in itself, and specifically the war on drugs, right? Which is what all of your other evidence is talking about, and why I think that Cleo's arguments ultimately can flow your way in that sense, right? That it is a bigger question. That's why that has to be the locus of resistance that you're talking about, right? And then I think that whatever their methodology is in terms of rejecting this sovereignty question is not precluded by your criticisms of that same system. Because the fact that you don't come out and say, we reject that, I think you can also make the argument that you, unlike sovereignty claims for native nations, right? Other populations within the United States don't get to make those same claims. They don't get to say in the same way, we are an autonomous body separate from the United States. And I think that that changes the question back to what you want it to be, which is speaking from your particular location or from the lived experiences of individuals. Does that make sense a little bit more?
Yeah.
Also, I think probably the four of you should call out to some degree that this now becomes these are somewhat in terms of power dynamics and issues, right? Like you should call out that we are once again in a debate space where there is some middle-class cisgender white woman with a ballot, right, gets to talk about these things. And I know you don't know me well enough to know if I would be down with that, but in general, not trusting a white woman is probably a good idea. And,
I don't know.
you know, yeah, you should probably just call that stuff out because this idea that you're talking about the debate space and what we get to do, and there are structures we replicate within this debate space that cause some of those problems. That's why direct calls and challenges to the debate space are important. That was actually that was actually some really good articulation that was happening like in the 2AC into the 1AR. It's kind of the debate space itself got lost a little bit in the 2AR as well. And I think talking about how those power structures, why do we have to have conversations about, you know, measures where we increase diversity in judging and stuff like that, because it is an issue of who is evaluating and judging these debates, right? And if it is important to speak from lived experience, why the hell do people who don't have those lived experiences get to sit and decide the validity of them within the context of the debate? So I think those become valid questions. And if you want, I will give you the list of people from the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. You can make that argument.
From the 1AR, was there anything like, besides the extension of the Dawn evidence?
I'd also say the evidence, because of how she's articulating the 2AC and the 2AR, that Salieri evidence, I think highlighting that would make that a little bit clearer in terms of the argument she's trying to make. Just, I think that's one of those, like, this is what it turns out I'm going for the 2AR. I was kind of like, oh, I was like, that was kind of interesting in the 2AC. I didn't really hear it in the 1AR. Oh, it's coming back. Like, crap, let me go put this together. I think that a non-traditionally flowed debate can be really great, but it can also be really hard for the 1AR because you have to kind of keep track of everything at the same time and condense it down to sort of the key elements. To some extent, I'm not even sure that articulating things as the perm debate is as necessary as the disads to their alternative that you've originally come up with in the 2AC, right? Rather than spending some time on this competition issue, just go straight out with here's where their methodology is not going to address our concerns. I do also think you need to address, though, that bottom warrant in the second King evidence that talks about why decolonization, which literally would say, this is no longer a US space, there don't get to be prisons here, there doesn't get to be a legal system here, and it is articulated in the context of that card as a rejection of functionally the prison industrial complex. I do think you need to address that piece of evidence more specifically if you're going to say they don't solve the prison industrial complex. Because that card is just assuming everything you're talking about.
Parents.
Oh, Lord.
What happened?
We're in Oklahoma, CA.
The fuck?
Dang.
I was about to ask if you have any other questions. I was like, nope, there's Gary.
Oh wow, we got Dom as a judge.
Oh,
God,
nice.
fucking Chris Kozak.
We're in here, though.
Crazy.
Team Crazy.
Yep.
Are we still filming?
Fucking crazy.
So we're still filming.
My bad.
It's okay.
Sorry, Kozak.
Kozak, we do thank you. I love you anyway.
Yeah. Well, actually, this one's really fun because they're gonna say something policy in front of Dominique, and we're gonna say anti-black.
Not only that, they're gonna say something policy.
Oh, it's
Policy
Dom.
boring.
Figure out here my.
All right, cool. We need a
All right, can I have a question?
So Gary's decided that I'm not judging with all